Hey everybody. I've taught several people about solar and how to do the different conversions and how to think about what do the solar panels mean and the wattage and the volts and the amp hours and the wattage of the inverter and how does all of that work. So I've got a really good analogy that I've used for a couple of years with other people I know, some friends that have asked about it. And basically, I'm going to try to keep this really simple and keep the math minimal. So basically, if you can think of solar as electricity is water in this analogy, okay? So what we're trying to do is we've got a solar generator here. And a solar generator is basically consisted of four main pieces. We got solar panels, and then we got a solar charge controller, and then we've got batteries, and then an inverter. So essentially, if you think of this as water, these first two, solar panels and a charge controller, is water collection. And then our batteries are our storage tank. And then the inverter is how we're going to use the stored water. Okay? So there's a few really simple equations. We'll get into that in just a second. So imagine for a second that, we're going to do this one. Here's the water, okay? Here we're collecting a bunch of rainwater in this little panel, collecting water droplets. We gather it together and we pump it up into this water tank. Okay. And then we have an outlet, a spigot. We can pour it into this little bucket. And so basically we have a certain amount of water that can come in. We have a certain size of the tank. And we have a certain amount of water or flow rate. Both of these are flow rates, like gallons per hour. Total number of gallons. And then also a max amount of water that we can pull out of that. So that is equivalent to, instead of collecting water, we're collecting happy rays of sunshine with our solar panel. That energy is going to go to our converter, our solar charge controller, that's going to change the form of that energy into a form that we can charge a battery. The battery is the same thing as our big water tank. Okay, so it's where we store the energy. And then we have this thing called an inverter that takes the battery energy and converts it to something like what you're used to seeing, like the outlet that you plug your stuff into. Okay, and that could be battery chargers, flashlights, or other lighting, different tools, kitchen appliances, whatever you want. Now, let me add a little bit more detail, but before we add some detail, we need to go over a couple really simple equations, okay? There's something you need to know. This is a very easy equation. P equals V times I. This is P for power is equal to V is, or volts, or voltage, times the current. Power is measured in watts, voltage is measured in volts, and this I, the current, is measured in amps. The numbers and the math gets really easy. And understanding this gets really, really easy when we convert everything to watts. Watts or watt hours. Okay. A watt hour is simply volts times amp hours. And I'll show you in a second. Here I've got two different batteries. You got watt hours is equal to volts times amp. So here's a tiny little 12 volt battery at 6 amp hours. So that's how big, or how the capacity. Think of this as gallons. How many gallons of water? So this is 12 volts times 6 amp hours, and we get 72 watt hours. Volts times amps is watts, hours, watt hours. 72 watt hours. Now this one here is one of my 12 volt 200 amp hour batteries. So 12 volts times 200 amp hours gets 2400 watt hours. Okay, that's a much bigger bucket than that. That will run out, I don't know how many, I don't want to do the math, a lot faster. What is that, 30 times, 300 times faster? Whatever, I can't do math. 30 times faster, something like that. So next, we're going to add to the analogy a little bit, okay? Here we're collecting our water, and let's pretend that we can collect 10 gallons per hour, okay? That pours into our tank, and our tank is 100 gallons. We can hold a total of 100 gallons, and the max flow rate we can get out of the tank is a whopping 100 gallons per hour. So let's pretend like this is a much bigger pipe than this one here. Okay. Now, this is the maximum flow rate. So if I only need a flow of 10 gallons per hour or 5 gallons per hour, I can just turn it open more or close it more and get more water out or less water out. And this is the inverter. So when I say max flow rate, that's the same as your inverter maximum watts that it can produce or convert. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to pull it all the time. That depends on your usage. If you're not pulling very much, well, then you won't use very much. So here's the solar analogy. So let's pretend I've got 10 solar panels that are 10 volts at 10 amps apiece, wired in series like this. So the amps stay the same. They go 10 volts plus another 10 volts. There's 20 volts and 10 amps, 30 volts and 10 amps, all the way up to 100 volts at 10 amps. So that would be, if I do 100 volts times 10 amps, 1,000 watts. Okay. Then I've got my converter, and this is what the converter does, is it takes 100 volts at 10 amps, 1,000 watts in, 1,000 watts out, and it converts it to something that can charge the battery. The battery is at 12 volts. So I did the math real quick, 83 amps. So we're still 1,000 watts in, 1,000 watts out. It's just going to convert it from this voltage and current to this voltage and current. This is why I was saying if we can convert everything to watts, it's way easier. So let's take this example of this battery here. Let's pretend that's the battery, 12 volt, 200 amp hours. We've got 2,400 watt hours. Okay, that's how big the tank is. Add more batteries, and that'll add more tanks. So then I've got my inverter. That takes 12 volts. This is a power converter, and so is this. It's just a different kind of power converter. This converts 12 volt DC from a battery and converts it into 120 volt AC, so it looks like a plug like that. So again, if we're pulling, let's say we're collecting 1,000 watts, we've got a 2,400 watt battery, but we're using 2,000 watts. That means we're getting 1,000 watts from here. This is using 2,000, so 1,000 watts has to come from the battery. So the battery's starting to drain. That math is really simple. Got 120 volt AC times 16 amps. Well, that's 2,000 watts. Okay. So this would be like, here's an example. Let's say we got 2 freezers and they're 1,500 watts. 1 battery charger and it's 250 watts, and a bunch of lights, that's 250 watts. So that would sum up 2,000 watts. And if this inverter could only put out 2,000 watt max, then we'd be maxing it out. We'd be using it all. Now, if as soon as these freezers turn off during their cycles, let's say it gets up to temperature and it turns off until it gets below a certain temperature to turn back on. Let's say they both do that. So 1,500 watts are gone. Now we still have the battery charger, say, and the lights, so that's only 500 watts. Okay, so now this capable 2000 watt inverter is only producing 500 watts. So now what we're doing is we have an excess. Let's say we're still generating, we're still collecting. You guys, does this make sense? We're collecting the energy, 1000 watts, and these turned off. So we've only got 500 watts being pulled. So now we've got an excess of 500 watts going into charging the battery. So, you know, that's the same as like, okay, I might be able to do 100 gallons an hour, but actually I'll get into examples in the next video. I wrote out a couple examples, and we'll work through those. They're very simple. I'll start with water, and then we'll do solar, battery, stuff like that.